What was the first sport utility vehicle? One might discover an answer such as the 1984 Jeep Cherokee XJ, or the 1974 Jeep Cherokee SJ, or maybe even something like the Willys Jeep MB, or the 1935 Chevy Suburban. There doesn't really seem to be a consensus on what the first SUV is. One might think certainly the first usage of sport utility vehicle in application to a vehicle would signify the first SUV, right? The Ford Bronco is described as a sport utility vehicle in some of its marketing materials, but that was referring to a two-door pickup truck version of the Bronco, not an SUV. If you want to go back even further, in 1947, the Crosley CC4 used sport utility, but that was in description of a convertible build, so it wasn't applicable. No, the definition that we use today is most applicable in the form of the 1970 Jeep Cherokee SJ. And I found myself thinking, certainly SUVs have a longer history than 1974. But there was something to keep in mind here. In order to trace back the fossil record of the sport utility vehicle, we must agree on the terminology in use. What is a sport utility vehicle? The problem was that I had plenty of answers. If we wanted to summarize some of these internet dictionary definitions, we'd have 3 out of 6 mentioning off-road capabilities, although a fourth does mention the word rugged. 5 out of 6 mention four-wheel drive, and 3 out of 6 define it as a vehicle with a truck chassis, although one of them does say truck-like. They are compared to large cars or station wagons, described as high performance, roomy, or powerful. This is not the precise definition one needs to trace back an exact definition and see where it applies. Certainly, I thought, there must be government regulation or legislation that is firm upon the definition of what an SUV is. Turns out this wasn't helpful either. The Environmental Protection Agency considers them light trucks for emission standards up until 2004 and then refers to them as cars. On the other hand, the Corporate Average Fuel Economy Regulation calls them light trucks, which they define as, quote, greater carrying capacity than passenger carrying volume, end quote. That being said, in 2011, CAFE regulations were changed to include small two-wheel drive SUVs as cars. State regulations vary widely on the definition of an SUV. So why is this definition so inexact? Well, because sport utility vehicle is a marketing term, not a classification. I kept digging for a better answer, and I stumbled across the book High and Mighty, The Dangerous Rise of the SUV by Keith Bradsher. In this book, Keith Bradsher comes up with a definition for the SUV. He defines it as the following, quote, four-wheel drive or includes a four-wheel drive option, an enclosed rear cargo area, high ground clearance for off-road travel, uses a pickup truck underbody, and designed primarily for urban consumers. Bradsher's definition also includes a distinction between a crossover and an SUV, saying that the crossover has the exact same definition, but rather than having a truck underbody or platform, the crossover is made in a unibody construction style. We're going to complicate the question slightly further by attempting to exclude crossovers from this question. Originally, crossovers simply meant an SUV of unibody construction, but like SUV, crossover is a marketing term as well. They are oftentimes used interchangeably for describing vehicles, although there seems to be a common understanding of a difference between crossover and sport utility vehicle. I put together a quick survey for my friends at Fred Haas Toyota Country, and I asked their professional sales staff which of Toyota's current lineup is a crossover and which is an SUV. Unsurprisingly, there were variants in the answers, but there was a shocking amount of agreement. Note, this was before the 2021 Toyota Venza was returned back to the SUV lineup of Toyota. In all answers, the CHR was considered a crossover, and the 4Runner, Sequoia, and Land Cruiser were considered SUVs. Where disagreement took place was in the classification of the RAV4 and Highlander. So why is that? Well, the CHR is unibody. It does not have an all-wheel drive or four-wheel drive option. It has low ground clearance. It is rather small, being considered subcompact, and it is styled very similarly to a car. Where on the flip side, The 4Runner, Sequoia, and Land Cruiser are at the smallest a mid-sized SUV. They all have four-wheel drive or all-wheel drive options, they're body on frame, and they have high ground clearance designed for off-road travel. These are all traditional sport utility vehicle traits. Then let's take a look at the RAV4 and Highlander in Toyota's lineup, which are unibody, but do have increased ground clearance, do have some off-road style characteristics, include all-wheel drive options, and are larger than the subcompact CHR. So although this is not an exact definition, this gives us a very good place to start. We know that the following are SUV traits: usually a larger size, higher ground clearance, truck chassis construction, and an all-wheel drive or four-wheel drive option. Not all are 100% necessary to fit this definition, but let's keep them in mind as we trace things backwards. One thing we know for sure, however, is that a sport utility vehicle lacks the standard trunk of a sedan or car, and it lacks the open bed of a pickup truck. As one of the salesmen put it to me, you know one when you see one. So, although it's clear as mud, let's go back to our 1984 Jeep Cherokee XJ. This vehicle does have a high ground clearance. It is a large vehicle. It includes an all-wheel drive or four-wheel drive option, but it is unibody. It's very difficult to look at this vehicle and not define it as a sport utility vehicle, especially as it is the first generation of vehicle to follow the 1974 Jeep Cherokee SJ, which birthed the term sport utility vehicle. Although it was marketed mainly as a sport wagon, the Cherokee SJ was a two-door full-sized SUV based on a previous model, the two-door Jeep Wagoneer. This vehicle was body on frame, included an all-wheel drive or four-wheel drive option, and did have increased ground clearance for off-road travel. So, certainly fits the definition of an SUV. But let's return to its legacy, the aforementioned Jeep Wagoneer. Well, the Jeep Wagoneer entered production in 1963. It's a luxury, full-sized, four-wheel drive vehicle on a truck chassis. Although it was marketed as a station wagon, which are typically long cars, the Wagoneer featured a very high ride height. I know I did call it the Jeep Wagoneer, but it was called Kaiser Jeep at the time, just for a side note. Certainly, the 1963 Jeep Wagoneer fits the definition of an SUV. And fits the definition that the salesman gave me. You know it when you see it. It looks like an SUV. So let's continue back through the legacy of this vehicle. What was the predecessor to the Wagoneer? Well, that brings us to 1946's Willys Jeep station wagon. This was the first mass-marketed all-steel station wagon designed and built as a passenger vehicle. Upon debuting, did not have a four-wheel drive option, but that did come through in 1949. Besides that, this was a truck chassis vehicle, had a higher occupancy, and had an increased ride height. But certainly we know that the 1946 Willys Jeep station wagon was not the first SUV, because we're speaking about the 1945 Willys Overland CJ2A. This was the first full production post-war Jeep designed for the public, and it featured an off-road intent, two doors, four-wheel drive, and on a body-on-frame truck chassis. Although it is a very small vehicle, we can't look at the Jeep Wrangler of today or the Willys Overland Jeep CJ2A of the time and not define it as the modern definition of a sports utility vehicle. What was the predecessor to the CJ2A? Well, why don't we consider its two previous prototypes? First, the CJ2, which was a prototype from 1944 to 1945. Around 40 were built, but was not made available for retail. Lots of modifications and improvements were made from the CJ1, CJ standing for Civilian Jeep. It seemed to be a very quick modification of the Willys Overland MB. Now, the Willys MB was produced from 1940 to 1945, a light off-road people mover designed for wartime off-road conditions. It was the primary light transport vehicle of the United States and its allies and was a huge success, making four-wheel drive a publicly understood automobile feature. It was on a truck chassis, it was intended for the off-road, it had good ground clearance, so it meets all characteristics that we decided on for the purpose of a sport utility vehicle definition. However, this vehicle was only designed and implemented for military use. Can we call something for a strictly military application an SUV? For the purpose of our discussion, I decided that this would not apply. That is similar to calling an LAV or a Humvee an SUV, and it really doesn't fit. Although they provide plenty of utility, there's no sport involved. This is not a recreational type vehicle. This is not for civilian consumption. So I think we may need to add this for our criteria of what an SUV is. It can't be military use only. And truthfully, the Willys MB was in a category of a lot of military-intended off-road light vehicles, including the 1940 Humber Heavy Utility, the 1936 Cherokee Type 95, and the prototype predecessor to the Cherokee Type 95, the 1934 Mitsubishi PX33. But maybe we can find an SUV predecessor to the Willys MB. What was the vehicle that inspired this off-road capable vehicle? While the Willys MB was based on many things, one of the main inspirations for the vehicle's capabilities came from the Austin 7 military car that the British had used previously to World War II. This was a two-wheel drive military adaptation of an Austin car. It was body-on-frame and had notable off-road capabilities. But we do have to invite something else into evidence. Around this time, all vehicles were body-on-frame. Although Unibody was attempted as early as 1922, it would not be widely implemented until far after some of the vehicles that we've discussed already. Although the Austin 7 military car was body-on-frame, it was not built on a truck chassis, but a car one. So considering that it's a two-wheel drive and it's on a car chassis, I would not define this vehicle as an SUV. So we hit a dead end at the end of our legacy, tracing all the way back from 1984 to the inspiration for the Willys MB. Does that make the Willys CJ1 prototype the first SUV? Well, let's try out other military-adjacent four-wheel drive vehicles. In 1938, there was a vehicle created called the GAZ-61. GAZ is an acronym that stands for Gorvosky Automobilsny Zavod, which is a Russian automaker. The GAZ-61 was a four-wheel drive, full-sized car for civilians and the Russian military. It was a lifted off-road four-wheel drive sedan car body from the GAZ 1173. It had a driven front axle leading to high ground clearance. So it was a four-wheel drive modified car chassis. Since it was body on frame and it was modified from a base car chassis, it leans a little bit more towards SUV characteristics. But certainly this couldn't have been the first four-wheel drive vehicle. That brings us back to 1893, referred to as the Diplock steam locomotive. This was a four-wheel drive steam engine using a traction engine, an engine specifically designed for tractors. It was designed to off-road. Of course, it would be body on frame, as Unibody did not exist yet, with, if you take a look at it, basically a locomotive's body. I would certainly say that this vehicle would be a stretch. And although it was four-wheel drive, it operated on steam, used a tractor engine, and locomotive design. So due to the look of the vehicle, let's go back to that salesman's definition of an SUV. It simply does not even look like an SUV. So let's move forward. That brings us to 1899's Lohner-Porsche mixed hybrid. So we've already touched on the first four-wheel drive vehicle, but now we're about to touch on the first hybrid vehicle, which also happened to be four-wheel drive. It was very slow, it was heavy and cumbersome. On top of that, it didn't have the capabilities of handling rough road. It had a motor for each wheel rather than the transfer of power from an engine to differentials that separated the power to each wheel. So I wouldn't say that this is fitting for the definition of an SUV. That brings us to 1903 Spyker's 60 horsepower. It was the first four-wheel drive system with a single engine, the first four-wheel braking system, and it was the first application of a six-cylinder engine. It was commissioned for a Paris to Madrid race in 1903 and later used as a hill climb racer. Off-road intention, four-wheel drive, but this car is very small. It doesn't particularly have a huge ground clearance, and it was designed as a race car on a car-style chassis. Let's also apply the salesman technique of looking at it, and we do not see an SUV. We'll move forward in time again to 1908's Badger four-wheel drive Battleship. This vehicle was a prototype. a four-wheel drive car with a gasoline engine. This meets similar issues as previous mentions. It's simply a car that also is four-wheel drive. But if we bump forward to 1910, there was a Badger four-wheel drive Model 100F and had an open touring car body designed for 7 people. I like this one. It has a high occupancy like most SUVs, suggesting it has a high payload capacity. It's meant to be rugged and unstoppable, hence the prototype nickname, the Battleship. But although I like it, I'm not sure it encapsulates the completeness of an SUV, as it still is a four-wheel drive car, simply with seating for 7. So maybe we should just keep digging and keep moving forward. 1934 Opel Geländesportwagen. This is a four-wheel drive racing car again, but we hit the same problem as the 1903 Spyker 60 horsepower. It was low. It was designed for racing off-road, but really it would probably fit a better definition as the modern equivalent of a rally car rather than a sport utility vehicle. Maybe military and motorsports applications aren't where we should look, but pivot to civilian consumer markets. Let's check out station wagons. Back in the 1910s, woody wagons or depot hacks were all the rage. Typically, they were Model T chassis with big, wooden, high-occupancy bodies built on them. Depot hacks is something that might be a little bit different for people in America, as depot does refer to a train depot, but a hack referred to a hackney carriage, which were pretty much the taxis of the 1910s in the United Kingdom. They were designed to go to and from train stations to bring people back to their homes. Hence, station wagons. They were not SUVs, they were simply high-occupancy body-on-frame cars. They were also called Suburbans or Carryalls. And if we follow this back up further, this brings us to the 1933 Chevrolet Suburban Carryall. The Chevy Suburban is the longest-running vehicle nameplate in history. There are still Chevy Suburbans being made today, and there are popular full-sized SUVs. But they have changed a lot over their lifespan. In 1933, Chevy had a wood-bodied station wagon top and mounted it on a half-ton panel truck chassis. Sounds promising. Where this gets complicated is when you add in that it was built specifically for the purposes of the National Guard and Civilian Conservation Corps. So in 1933, the Chevy Suburban was really only for governmental or military use. I would not define this as an SUV. This exclusivity would not last long, however. In 1935, Chevy would release the Suburban openly. It was a steel-enclosed 8-seater station wagon on a truck frame designed to, quote, carry all, end quote, cargo and passengers alike. This is the most widely accepted answer for the first SUV. Chevy has used this vehicle many times in their advertising. They themselves tout that they have invented the SUV. It does have a few detractors, though. Chevrolet did not offer four-wheel drive until 1957 for the Suburban. It wasn't really designed with off-road capability in mind, although it was fairly capable. But on top of it, where I'm going to dig in that most other people don't necessarily suggest, is it was advertised as almost exclusively commercial. As we know, woody wagons and station wagons, Suburbans and Carryalls were all designed with a commercial, taxi-like purpose in mind. In 1938, Westchester Suburban was the first advertised Suburban as a consumer vehicle rather than a commercial vehicle. The Suburban wouldn't begin being advertised as a consumer vehicle until much, much later, long after World War II even. What makes this a little complicated is that does not mean it wasn't available for consumers, but it was intended and sold for commercial use. Does that discredit it as an SUV? It's debatable. So as keeping it in mind as the best option, let's move forward and check out a few other eclectic possibilities. In the late 1910s to early 1920s, a group of individuals called the Vagabonds, which included Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, Harvey Firestone, John Burroughs, and several other wealthy people of the time, would take annual camping trips. They designed a vehicle that has come to be known as the Lincoln Camp Car. It took a 1922 Lincoln limousine and rebuilt it as a truck with a camp kitchen to carry food and utensils and other necessities for these camping trips. It was covered. It was necessary for it to be off-road capable, but was two-wheel drive. They were built body on frame, but it was on a car limousine chassis. So I do think that this is an honorable mention, but I don't necessarily think it applies. Well, let's try another unique answer to this question. Going back to 1911, Adolphe Cagrese worked as a professional chauffeur and head of the mechanical department of the Russian Imperial Garage, hired by none other than Tsar Nicholas II of the Russian Empire. He came up with what would be called the Cagrese track. It was rubber or canvas continuous track on a wheel-included chassis augment. This would allow these cars to have increased grip area and spread the vehicle weight out, which would increase off-road capabilities and give it greater clearance. This would be later called half-track cars. Unfortunately, the Russian Revolution took place in 1917, and he was forced to flee home to his home country of France. He went to work for the French Citroën, and he would make half-track off-road vehicles and military vehicles while there. He augmented the French automotive company's Type B2 into half-tracks, and they were available basically as an option. B2s were implemented in a publicity campaign for the company by crossing a wide point of Africa with half-track augments. So this is a great example of an off-road capable car. But I really do have a couple problems with this. If you take a normal vehicle and augment it with a massive lift, does that make it an SUV? There's a really good example. In 1930, there was an augment of a Ford vehicle where it was given tractor tires and tractor axles, and I would look at that and say it looks SUV adjacent, but it's simply an augment aftermarket to a non-SUV to make it SUV-like. I don't know that augments would necessarily be applicable. On top of that, can we define half-track vehicles as cars at all? We look at this vehicle and we don't think SUV. Certainly there had to be a vehicle that hit these characteristics previous to 1935. I wasn't a huge fan of the 1935 Chevy Suburban as the answer, simply because it didn't cover all of the characteristics, and I figured there must be a better answer. This brings us to 1907, the Dernburg-Wagen. Mercedes-Benz in regards to this vehicle, quote, "the first passenger vehicle with all-wheel drive for everyday use," end quote. This was a design by DMG, or, if I want to stretch my German capabilities, Daimler Motoren Gesellschaft. It was named after then State Secretary Bernhard Dernburg. This vehicle was designed with long journeys on rough terrain in mind. To pursue that goal, this vehicle was built on a truck chassis. It featured 12.6 inches of ground clearance, 157.5 inches of wheelbase, and 55.9 inches in front and back track width. It featured 2 seats up front and 4 in back, a higher occupancy car. It featured a sunroof, a luggage rack on the vehicle's rear and one on the roof, tent tarpaulins attached to the right and left below the roof to lower and protect the passengers from weather, similar to a soft top, and it weighed about 7,200 pounds. It had a water-cooled 35 horsepower 4-cylinder engine, and it featured about a max of 25 miles per hour on a flat road. It also was engineered to have parts that would be susceptible to sand be additionally protected so it could be used off-roading in the African German colonies of the time. So we can look that this vehicle has all SUV characteristics. But there are a few things that don't make it completely perfect. This is a one-off vehicle. Although I don't personally believe that this would discredit the vehicle as the first SUV, there are some who would feel that way. Additionally, this vehicle, upon the start of World War I, was abandoned in Africa after driving around 10,000 kilometers through the African colonies. So, since it was never entered in production and it was a one-off, that can be used to potentially detract from the value of this vehicle being the first SUV. It is difficult in comparison to the 1935 Chevy Suburban to consider this the first SUV, as the direct legacy of the Suburban can be seen as it's still a vehicle of today. Although this answer isn't perfect, I do believe the 1907 Dernburg-Wagen is the first modern depiction of a sport utility vehicle. So if you're ever out and it comes up in conversation what the first sport utility vehicle may have been, it may just be easier to say the 1935 Chevy Suburban. But that being said, I do believe, in consideration with accepting this definition, that this would be the first example. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Mitchell, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks a lot.